Thank you and welcome back for our final panel of the day. And it's going to be a fascinating topic. As you've seen, it's mass media and social networks, talking about journalists and influencers. My name's Frank Langfitt. I work for National Public Radio, spent a lot of time overseas in China and war in Ukraine, things along those lines. And I'm now covering the Trump administration and democracy and authoritarianism, which is keeping me pretty busy. And I know all the panels are great, but we have a really especially interesting one here because people are going to be able to talk. I love comparative politics. And we're going to be talking really about how governments and other actors influence thinking, how they erode trust. And I just want to make a quick introduction of our panel today. To my left is Jeff Conroy-Krutz. He's an associate professor and chair of comparative politics at Michigan State University. He's going to talk about media capture, among other things. But he's particularly going to talk, and I'd like to hear about a radio station in the Central African Republic that he thinks is really quite helpful along the lines of the things that people have been studying. Next to him is Michael Mirny. He's International Research and Exchanges Board, IREX. He specializes in the Russian-speaking world. He's also an adjunct professor here at Georgetown. James Okong'o is a journalist from Nairobi, covers disinformation. This is a fascinating job. In Africa for Agence France-Presse. He's finishing up as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard. And I'm interested in hearing from James about, particularly in parts of East Africa, how some of these operations recruit young people to work on misinformation, disinformation. He has described it as like a transfer window in global football. And then flying all the way from Brazil, Nara Pavao. She's at the Federal University of, and I may butcher this, Pernambuco. She's an associate professor, a political scientist. And she is going to be able to also talk, particularly, I think, about the differences between the disinformation networks and the content of disinformation that she sees in the global south and compared to parts in the north. So if we could first just have a round of applause for our panelists. And the way we're going to do this is I think we're going to talk, our panelists are going to talk a bit about their research. I'm going to then ask them some questions because I have a ton of questions about this and this sphere because it's very relevant to the kind of work that I do and many of my colleagues do, and then open up for questions from the audience. So Jeff, would you like to start?
Sure. Thanks for the introduction.
Sure.
I want to thank the organizers of this event. It's been a great 2 days, and I'm really appreciative of being included as a part of it. My research is on political communication in Africa with a focus on opinion and behavior. So I'd like to approach my introductory comments, which is on the state of media freedom in Africa from the perspective of public trust. And the concept of public trust has been something that has really been underpinning a lot of what we've been talking about over the last 2 days. Anti-democratic leaders, using their rhetoric, using disinformation to undermine trust in democratic institutions. But what they're really often doing is taking advantage of pre-existing disenchantment with institutions, so the dry tinder is kind of already there for them to work with. And the same holds for media, especially in Africa. In many ways, there's a crisis of public trust in media across the continent, and this has, I would argue, facilitated a lot of the attacks we've seen by executives on media. I think to understand where media in Africa are today, you really have to go back to the political liberalizations that occurred in the mid-1990s across most countries on the continent. Before that point, most countries had de jure state-owned media monopolies, usually of broadcasting, sometimes of print publications as well. But then when you had political liberalization occurred, there was a massive opening up of the media sector. You had an absolute explosion in the number of media outlets, privately owned media outlets in most countries, particularly in radio, which is still the most accessed mass medium on the continent. So for example, in Ghana, where I do a lot of my research, there was one state-owned radio station in the early 1990s. That was the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation. Today, there are over 500 radio stations across the country. So these changes were really essential for broader democratic transitions. You can't have democratic transitions without free and independent media, as we know. But they were also marked by, I'm going to steal this line from Thomas Carruthers' presentation yesterday. Tom was the first boss I ever had in DC. Well, at a paying job. I did some unpaid internships, like I'm sure everyone else did. But so I'm going to continue borrowing from Tom, and he referred to this concept, which was referred to in the previous panel as well, as of this idea of rushing into pluralism. And I do think that does explain, that concept of rushing into pluralism does explain a bit what happened with regards to media development in Africa. And I think it's generated a lot of the pathologies that we see still affecting the media space there today. By rushing into pluralism, I'm mainly talking about the development of a very liberal model for media systems in societies where the resource base really couldn't support them. So many folks, when you had this initial opening up, rushed to set up their own media houses, thinking there was a profit to be made. For some, there were profits to be made. For others, many, probably more, there weren't. In order to have truly independent media, especially in FM radio, because you don't have a subscriber model for FM radio, right? You need advertising revenue. In order to have advertising revenue, you need a strong private sector. And in many of these systems, you didn't have a strong enough private sector to support the kind of advertising revenue that independent media needed. And so as a result of this, the combination of intense competition for advertising revenue and then not enough of it to go around, you had a number of pathologies that developed alongside of it. And I just want to quickly cite 4 of these pathologies, all of which we've seen in our public opinion data, either data that I've collected on my own or as part of my affiliation with Afrobarometer. And all of those pathologies are associated, I would argue, with diminished trust in media on the continent. The first of the 4 is media capture. Which I believe was referred to earlier today. We saw this in the development of independent media in the United States, right? Without a strong private sector to provide advertising revenue, media entrepreneurs are prone to capture bipartisan actors. These partisan actors support certain media outlets with either direct infusions of resources or steering advertising from politically connected businesses, or if they're in government, giving them lucrative access to government contracts. But this leads to overtly partisan content. Citizens start to see media more as mouthpieces for particular political actors, not as independent sources of information. And in the most extreme examples, we have seen media capture lead to the propagation of hate speech and even violence in some African countries. The second tendency is towards sensationalism. So the more intense this competition becomes, you need, as a media organization, to show that you can capture a large audience. You need that to attract advertisers, and this often incentivizes the most sensationalistic kinds of reporting that you can provide over sober investigation. The third pathology that I would identify is that you often just don't have the resources in many media organizations on the continent to do investigative journalism. This is expensive. It requires resources. A lot of times you can't afford to pay the best trained journalists. You can't provide them with adequate resources to spend a lot of time covering a story from different angles. And you also don't have a lot of resources to do independent fact checking. So you combine this with a desire to capture an audience quickly. You have a lot of media organizations that will find a piece of information that they've come across on social media, or sort of just what they used to call a pavement radio, word on the street, right? And they want to rush to be the first to get that out there, and so they will rush to send it out there without fact checking it first. Audiences are increasingly picking up on this and finding that there's a lot of misinformation on the media. Incidentally, I have interviewed folks at dozens of radio stations across more than a dozen countries on the continent, and almost every single time they say, this is a problem with all of our competitors, but we don't do it. Someone is deluding themselves, I think. And the fourth pathology that I would identify is a disconnect between average citizens' lives and what the media are focusing on. When you don't have a lot of resources to do a lot of real on-the-ground reporting at the community level, what you instead end up doing is sending reporters to cover press conferences and to come back with press releases and to report those on air. It's the cheapest way to do reporting, but you often find citizens who say, what is reported in media is not relevant to my daily life, and therefore I don't really trust the information that's shared. So I'd argue that all of these pathologies, to wrap up, contribute to situations in which, for example, in Afrobarometer data, we see a negative correlation between how free people see media in their country and their support for media freedom. So the more free they see media in their country, the less likely they are to support media freedom. Another interesting correlation we see in the Afrobarometer data that I would say come out of these pathologies is that we see a positive correlation between general support for democracy and support for certain kinds of media censorship. So people don't see these as inimical to one another. They actually see censorship as supporting democracy, and I think that stems from these pathologies. So I'm looking forward to the discussion about how executive strategies kind of fit into this and the relationship to public opinion. More importantly, as you alluded to before, some potential cases for how we can build trust and support certain media outlets in building trust among the population and the sort of beneficial effects that can have for democracy. So I'm going to save those comments in case there are questions about them.
Thank you, Jeff. Michael?
Thank you, Jeff. Actually, we at IREX used to run a program to support media in Mozambique. We should have talked about it as well. Moreover, there are people in the audience, I'm not going to point my fingers at them, who used to run those programs. But anyways, good afternoon. Really good to be here. Nice to meet you, meet all of you here. Let me begin my quick presentation by saying that I know exactly what you did this morning when you woke up. I know exactly the very first thing that you did. Before I do that, I will still talk a little bit about IREX, because I represent this NGO, and not many of you might have heard about it. We were the largest international development media organization in the world until 90 days ago, about 90 days ago, when most of our USAID funded work, media development work, has been terminated. We still have quite a few programs. We still have large offices in Africa. We still have large offices in Ukraine and Jordan and other countries, but we used to run programs to support media producers, journalists, content creators, influencers globally, all over the world. I'm also, as Frank mentioned, an adjunct professor at Georgetown teaching a course on disinformation and propaganda. And interestingly enough, this year, surprise, surprise, I had quite a few people on the waiting list to take this class, which is very unusual for my class in my program. Back to your morning today. I am absolutely sure that the first thing you did this morning, most of you, you grabbed your phone to read the news, to read opinions, and to read maybe something that is potentially misinformation or disinformation. In a world where algorithms shape awareness, the question is no longer what's the news, but the question right now is whose version of reality we're all consuming. And according to a recent YouGov study, about 47% of people in the world read the news on their social networks. They use social networks as the first point where they encounter news on a daily basis. And it varies by countries. In the United Kingdom, for instance, it's about 25% of people. In Ukraine, it's 75% of people, not surprisingly. And there are a couple of issues that I wanted to raise in my very quick presentation, which I promised to be less than 5 minutes. First, I wanted to mention what IREX is doing in terms of algorithmic distortion. So algorithmic distortion is basically, I'm sure all of you know that whatever you do online is shaped by algorithms. YouTube is really good at showing you exactly those videos that are in line with what you watched before. Facebook and others are doing the same. The reason why they do it, they want you to keep scrolling. They want you to spend more time online. And the reason why they want to increase your engagement with their platforms is very simple. They are making money. As long as you're on their platform, they're making money. The platforms are free. And as we all know, if the product is free, you're the product. That's the core business model of those social networks. Now, those disinformation producers who we know are very active right now, and they have been very active globally, but of course, we mostly deal with Chinese disinformation propaganda when it comes to our work in Asia, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives, and Indonesia, or Russian, the Kremlin, when it comes to our work in the Republic of Georgia. And by the way, I was very waiting for somebody when they talked about protests to talk about the Republic of Georgia. I haven't heard that this morning, so maybe we can talk about media in Georgia as well. So Russians, of course, are targeting Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Serbia, and other places. I'm looking at our colleagues from Nicaragua. I was in Managua about 10 years ago. I went to the hotel and I turned on my TV, and the first thing that I saw on TV in Nicaragua was Russia Today in Spanish, which at that point really surprised me, not anymore. So basically, those disinformation producers, they've learned how to work with those algorithms really well. Globally, and it's not just Facebook or YouTube, any social network from TikTok to LinkedIn, disinformation producers are really good now at fine-tuning their messages to reach different constituencies, to make sure that you either cast your ballot for one candidate or another, or if they don't want you to cast your ballot, they may confuse you, demoralize you, and you will stay home and not go vote. And this is just one of the examples. It would be a mistake to think that, folks in the Kremlin or in Beijing really just simply want you to vote for one candidate or another. Quite often it is that they want you to stay home. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there is certain content that is being shared more than others, and we all know that this type of content is emotional. Disinformation producers really focus on producing emotional content because, according to a very well-known MIT study, fake news is shared about 70% more, or false news 70% more than non-false news online. And basically, the reason why it is shared more is because it's false news or fake news, disinformation, is usually very emotional, and it targets certain types of emotions. According to the study of a Ukrainian organization called Stop Fake, and they know a thing or two about disinformation, being there in Ukraine and working for the last about 15 years. They have identified a number of emotions that are really being employed by the Russians, for instance, by Kremlin. Fear, anger, disgust, and surprise are on top of their list of emotions that are being more shared online than others. But also the problem is it's not that disinformation producers post this disinformation, then work around those algorithms, fine-tune those algorithms, and then we all receive those disinformation notifications on our phones. The problem is also that humans are actually sharing those disinformation and propaganda messages more than they share non-propaganda and non-disinformation messages. As I said, it is because the content is emotional, but also because media outlets globally, they do not really invest in information media literacy programs for journalists. Journalists, quite often, there is a phenomenon of paid journalism. There are people globally who would want to be paid, and then they would spread disinformation propaganda. But also there are millions of journalists all over the world who basically share disinformation messages unknowingly because they just don't know. I can give you an interesting example from Moldova. I was traveling in Moldova about 7 years ago in the Republic of Gagauzia, part of Moldova, where I met with an editor-in-chief of a local media station. And he told me, he said, you know what, we don't need any additional information literacy trainings. We already went through one a long time ago, not IREX, I have to say. And he said, you know what, one of the important things that I learned is that I have to be using different sources of information for my media outlet. And that's what I'm doing. And I said, which ones are you using? And he said, well, when it comes to news agencies, I'm using Sputnik. When it comes to foreign, meaning English language media outlets, we watch Russia Today, RT, not RT, which is the same thing. And then, we're neighboring Russia, so we have to get some news and information from Russia. So we watch the Russian TV in Russia. Yes, they are using 3 different media outlets, but you know what? All 3 are owned by the Kremlin. So basically, and this journalist was actually later, he was very active at those trainings, and they started using different outlets, different sources of information. What's important is that those are the trainings that really help media and information producers globally. Lastly, last thing I wanted to say is the demand side. Nobody can train the entire population of the entire country, any country, on how to recognize disinformation propaganda. It's impossible to do, you would say, right? If there was a representative from Finland, they would have raised their hand and said, well, you know what, you can't do that. In Finland, they start teaching students at the age of 6. They start with advertising. They show them ads, and they're like, okay, this is Colgate, and this is the ad. They want you to buy Colgate, and they're saying that this is the best toothpaste in the world. Do you believe them? And then it goes on, and then throughout high school, middle school, high school, elementary school, middle school, and high school, they learn information media literacy in Finland. And as a result of that, Finland is now ranked as, it has the highest score in the information and media literacy in the world, the score of 76 in comparison to Turkey. And I'm looking for a colleague from Turkey who was here earlier today. Turkey has a score of 16. Moreover, the best indication that it works is that Russia recently closed their Sputnik bureau in Finland. Just because, I mean, they didn't need it, because nobody would believe that. And I wanted to finish this opening remarks by saying thank you to all of those officers from USAID who are in this room, because I've noticed there are quite a few of them. Thank you for your service. Thank you for supporting civil society and media for so many years, and long hours, red-eye flights, and thank you for being here.
James, jump in.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my presentation here is on making a case for fact-checking. And this is because of my background as a journalist who's worked on the disinformation area, covering disinformation for several years across Africa. And I'm making this case because recently you saw Meta discontinued its collaboration with the fact-checkers across the world. And this raises questions because actually they discontinued it in the US, and this raises questions because now they might discontinue it in other parts of the world where people use non-English languages, and this could be even more problematic because it's only fact-checkers who are able to translate content that is shared in non-English languages in different parts of the world. So my presentation believes that we are actually living in a critical moment where anyone who cares about facts should be concerned about governments that are actually coming into place, politicians who on a daily basis are fighting journalists, are fighting people who share the truth. And earlier this year, we saw Vice President J.D. Vance, during a visit to Europe, spoke about the concept of the enemy within. And he was referring to the term misinformation as an outdated notion from the Soviet era. And he suggested that those who use it are trying to control or censor what others should think. And this was a target actually to the fact-checking community. And as a result of this viewpoint and the Trump administration's general disdain for the media, social media platforms that are controlled by some of the most powerful corporations are responding to these pressures by distancing themselves from their commitments to collaborate with independent fact-checkers. And this shift has actually made it increasingly difficult to expose falsehood that continue to cause real-world harm. And so my case, I'll answer the question about why actually fact-checking matters. And there's a misconception that actually fact-checking should do more, but I'll tell you what fact-checking cannot do. Fact-checking does not guarantee that an individual politician will win or lose an election. That's not the work of fact-checking. Secondly, fact-checking does not knock on doors or make people get out to vote. We don't do that. We just look at information, we debunk it, and provide the evidence out there for whoever wants to read or whoever wants to follow. Thirdly, fact-checking is not persuasive to individuals or communities that vote based on their cultural biases or values. As a fact-checker, I won't convince someone who votes blue to vote red and vice versa. That's a decision that someone makes on their own. But if you don't remember anything I say, at least remember what I'm about to say right now. However, what fact-checking does too, and what it does well, is that it resists false narratives and prevents them from becoming entrenched. It holds the line on reality for history's sake. It builds evidence-based records that can withstand political pressures. That is why politicians like Trump or William Ruto from Kenya, who seek to create their own realities, are fighting hard against fact-checking, and why they are now strong-arming tech companies into aiding them. And as a graduate student, as postgrad student at Harvard, I'm studying the link between politics, elections, and disinformation. And I did research in Kenya and Nigeria and came up with a story titled "Hashtags for Hire: How Paid Digital Mercenaries Interfered in Kenya and Nigerian Elections." As we speak here today, there are troll factories in Africa, and I know there are others in other parts of the world. They're big, and what happens in Africa, I think I mentioned it to Frank the other day. I was speaking to one of the disinformation spreaders. I usually call them digital mercenaries. And he was telling me that, we are currently actually in a transfer window. I think for anyone who follows soccer, you understand what a transfer window is. In Kenya, the elections are like 2 years away. In Nigeria, the next elections are like 3 years away. So for him to tell me that they are in a transfer window is that they're actually preparing for the next phase of elections. So they are trying to gauge who to work for. They are looking at the political organizations, like who are we going to support, who has the most money to pay us to do this kind of job. And these people, like from my findings, I realized that actually these people recruit from universities. They just don't go for any other person. They target very highly skilled people. They come to universities with a lot of money. Someone who is in university in Africa hasn't actually touched a lot of money, so they pay them in cash through proxies. They recruit them into running these disinformation campaigns. And they do a lot of work for them. So in Kenya, we have, like during the last elections, we had the leading candidates, who is President William Ruto and Raila Odinga. From my studies, because I follow them, from my studies, I realized that both of them actually employed these people, and they had like very big groups, teams of more than 50 people in each and every group, being paid by politicians to run disinformation campaigns. And they used bots to deploy harmful content. And some of them had you'll find an individual with up to 50 social media accounts on Meta, X, that they use to share disinformation. And I remember there's a guy who actually told me that he usually uses faces of pretty ladies in his accounts to attract traffic on his page. And he does it. And they share very dangerous materials. They share leaflets to polarize communities. And they also attack political opponents directly. And they use identity stuff such as tribe. Tribe is a big thing in Africa, both in Kenya and Nigeria. So there's a tribe, religion, there's witchcraft. There's a lot of stuff that is actually written about something, and these are very intelligent people, and they continuously share it until you find that part of the community actually tend to believe it. And this is the thing. And right now, as we are approaching the next election, these guys are actually regrouping again, because it's really hard to find jobs in these countries. You find that a lot of youths now, they actually now think that actually blogging, they call it blogging, and someone actually tried to correct me, telling me that what we do is called political communication. So they told me that it's actually a job, and they are trying to help politicians to communicate to the populace. So whatever they are told, but their masters tell them what they do, but they don't deal directly with the politicians. The politicians use proxies to pay them. They are paid in cash. They don't pay taxes to the government, but they are paid a lot of money above the local average that anyone else earns. But the problem that I've also found amongst these people is that some of the people I interviewed were very rich and richer than me, the average journalist. But some of them who are really horrible because they get paid during the campaign period and this money dries up. And the politicians will dump you immediately. And they didn't know what else to do, and they've already damaged their images. Their social media tracks are really bad. No employer would want to associate with such a person. So it's a really tough thing for these people. There are those who are doing well. I don't know how long they will do it because they are rich. And again, now we have like this same group of people. Some of them are even trying to get into government because like the president of Kenya has even employed one as a digital strategist in his office. He's so powerful. This is just a guy who started spreading disinformation. So he's the one who is actually in charge of hiring people to President Ruto's team. In Nigeria, it's the same thing. Their minister for information, I think, is also a former guy who used to spread disinformation. So I think it is a problem. I still continue to do the study, and I will come up probably with a book. And if maybe I'll just end it by saying that in today's world where information travels faster and can sometimes feel overwhelming, it is crucial to safeguard people from online harm. This is precisely why the role of fact checkers is increasingly vital. Thank you.
Thank you, James. All right, please.
So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. My idea here is to draw on the research I've been doing in Brazil to briefly highlight some points that might be important for the discussion we're going to have today. So the first point is about the prevalence of misinformation and also the type of problematic content that we should be worried about. As part of my project on misinformation in Brazil, which has been happening since 2018, me and my co-authors selected a sample of 1,000 high-profile politicians, and we collected their social media posts on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, X, for over 2 years. That resulted in a data set of 4 million posts, and then we applied different detection methods to identify misinformation. And the findings were very surprising to us. We found that less than 1% of these posts contained misinformation. We also find that the most common type of problematic content that is out there doesn't seem to be fake news, so blatantly false information, but rather very biased, misleading, and polarizing information that is not strictly false. Even though we draw a distinction between strictly false and just biased information, we are not saying that the latter is less problematic than the former. In fact, both types of content are problematic, and they produce very harmful effects. And I'm going to talk about 3 effects that we were able to detect in our studies. First, misinformation has the potential to divide societies around very important issues, such as the integrity of elections. Yesterday, the Chief Justice of Brazil's Supreme Court said that Brazil has the most reliable electoral system in the world, and he's probably right. But despite that, former President Bolsonaro decided to make election fraud claims a central part of his re-election campaign. And those are, can you just... So these are the statements made by Bolsonaro that contain falsehood about the electoral process. As we can see, these statements were prevalent throughout his term, intensifying in 2021, and also right before the elections in 2022. And then These are Google Trends data on searches for election fraud, which indicates that this became a very salient topic in Brazil. As this graph shows, levels of trust in elections. So basically, searches peaked around the 2022 elections. This was not a salient issue in Brazil. It's hard to believe that someone would cast doubt over a system that works pretty well. It's very efficient. But we see that during elections, this always becomes salient, and it became really salient during the 2022 elections. And this type of misinformation has a very damaging potential, right? And what we see too is that Brazilians are very divided around this issue, and the divisions follow partisan lines, right? So the red dots are trust in the percentage of Lula supporters, right, who trust elections, or who trust the electoral system and the ballots. And so before the elections, it's 97% among Lula supporters. When we go to Bolsonaro supporters, we see that it's less than 30% of Bolsonaro supporters trust elections in Brazil. And it's interesting to see that we measure that before and after the elections, but we find these divisions before the elections. So we are not capturing winner and losers effect. We see that before elections, people were already, divided along these lines. And we used different experimental methods designed to elicit truthful answers, because it was hard for us to believe that people were being sincere, especially Bolsonaro supporters, right? That they were being sincere. We thought that maybe they were just saying that they didn't trust the elections because they wanted to signal that they were Bolsonaro supporters. So we applied different methods to see if they were telling the truth or if they were perhaps lying. So we wanted to identify whether it was just partisan cheerleading. And we find that they really believe in this thing. So the belief is true, and these divisions really reflect divisions in perceptions and in beliefs in Brazil. So that's it. Although misinformation makes up a small part of the content political leaders in Brazil share online, we also find, and that's the other finding that I want to talk about, that social media users engage way more with posts that contain misinformation. So we find that posts with misinformation receive 10 times more engagement, so in terms of reactions, than posts without misinformation. So this type of content tends to get a lot of attention. And we also find that this engagement, the higher level of engagement we find with posts that contain misinformation, does not reflect any sort of pushback on these false claims. Quite the opposite. People are there because they really support those claims and they believe in those claims. We conducted 2 large-scale observed experiments in Brazil, and we find that in terms of the effects, right, what are the damages that this misinformation causes? So in these 2 studies we conducted during the 2018 elections, we find an exposure to politicians' posts containing misinformation depresses participation in favor of politicians who are targeted by these false or misleading claims. So the takeaway here is clear, right? Sharing misinformation pays off for politicians. Those who share misinformation online, they gain more attention without facing significant backlash, while their opponents have fewer supporters who are motivated or mobilized to take action in support of them or in support of their cause. So I've also been doing some studies on how to fight misinformation in Brazil. I want to talk about two studies we did. And I think the lessons we have here can be applied to other countries in the global south. So that contradicts a bit what James said, but based on the study we did in Brazil, we see that although fact-checking is the most widely used strategy to combat misinformation, and there's strong evidence that it works in the global north, we find that this strategy is largely ineffective in Brazil. And this is based on a study we conducted during the 2018 presidential elections in Brazil. And fact-checking corrections failed, and it failed consistently and across the board. These corrections failed even when we tried to correct information that people wanted to be wrong. Information that goes against one's political preferences or political priors. So fact-checking was highly ineffective. And in contrast, preemptive strategies, which have received far less attention, proved highly effective in Brazil, and it's probably effective in other parts of the Global South as well. So during the municipal elections of 2020, we conducted a field experiment in which we partnered with Folha de São Paulo, which is Brazil's oldest newspaper, and we ran with them a media literacy and awareness campaign designed to inoculate citizens against misinformation. And we find that these preemptive campaigns, they are very successful. They indeed reduced acceptance of misinformation. The effects were so large that we didn't believe them, so we had to replicate this study, and we had the same findings. And the last thing I would like to highlight is that comparing the Global South with the Global North, that detecting misinformation in the Global South is way more difficult than detecting misinformation in the Global North, because misinformation in the Global South circulates not only in social media like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, but especially in instant messaging apps like WhatsApp and Telegram, which are end-to-end encrypted. They don't have algorithm ranking. It's a very non-hierarchical structure and very protected, right? And about 80% of Brazilians use WhatsApp, and they're more and more using WhatsApp as a main source of information and of political information. And the problem with misinformation that circulates in these environments is that they don't come with a link. So it's really hard. It's just images, videos. So it's really hard to apply the dominant detection methods that were developed in the US that are based on the URL. You see where the URL comes from. If it comes from a domain that is deemed to be low quality, then that information is classified as false. You cannot do that in Brazil or in the Global South because misinformation does not come with a link. So fighting misinformation in the Global South is way more difficult and more challenging than in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Nara. So I'd like to just follow up on something you talked about, which is combating this. This is a huge problem, certainly in my field. And I wanted to ask you just a little bit briefly, how did you inoculate people? And to what degree were a lesson or two that you learned that you think might travel beyond Brazil?
So our campaign relied on two strategies, right? So we raised awareness. So we kind of prepared people to navigate this new informational ecosystem by saying, look, there's a lot of misinformation out there, be careful. So there was this awareness component, but we also invested on skills, right? So we gave people 8 tips on how to identify misinformation. So talking about the features, the characteristics of misinformation. So those are the 2 main things we did. And in terms of the lessons, right, to the Global South, I think fact-checking, so traditional media, at least in Brazil and in other parts in the Global South, is really associated with the traditional media. And people do not trust traditional media, so they don't trust these fact-checking agencies. They're not familiar with them, so they have no reason to believe in the corrections. And when we combine that with the fact that it's really hard to detect misinformation, and fact-checking, to fact-check an information, you have to detect that misinformation first, right? And it's really hard to detect them in the Global South.
What were the most effective, give me 2 of the most effective tips that you used to inoculate people.
We talked about language and also source.
Do you mean recognizing the nature of the language that was being used?
Exactly.
Inflammatory to try to drive fear and to drive emotion?
Exactly, that's it, yeah. And also, raising attention to sources, right? That information needs to come with a reliable source.
So trust is a huge issue. I mean, we find that all the time in the United States. It's a very, very different landscape than we would have dealt with 10 or 15 years ago. Jeff, could you talk a little bit about what you've learned about some of the projects you've worked on and building trust? So thinking as constructively as possible is how we can deal with this challenge.
Yeah. That's a great question because I framed my initial comments on this sort of crisis of trust, but then the real question before us, and I think it was posed to us to try to address, is like, what can we do to build trust? And I don't have a good answer to that. I'm launching a new research project on this, but I've seen some fascinating things in my research that like suggest that you can make tremendous strides as a media organization in building trust. And I know trust now when I see it. And I commented to you earlier about this case that I find really fascinating in Central African Republic, which I think has to be one of the most challenging places to do independent journalism in the world. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the weakest states, high levels of insecurity, very high levels of displacement amongst the population, and there's a lot of malign foreign actors involved in that country since independence. First the French, and then the Russians. Now it's basically the government is like owned by the Wagner Group. But I've been doing independent evaluations for several years of the largest radio network in the country, which is called Ndeke Luka. And I can point to some quantitative and qualitative indicators of just how trusted this media organization is amongst the population. And this is an extremely vulnerable population for the reasons that I gave you. So they have very good reasons to be very skeptical of the information they've received, because they've seen really firsthand when you act on bad information, it can have tremendously negative consequences for you, your community, and your family. So on the quantitative side, we did sort of a pre-post test of the launch of a new transmitter by this radio network in a region in the far west of the country along the border with Cameroon, Beloko, where there's a very large population of displaced people. And before we did before they launched, it was kind of a media desert. Only about 25% of people said they regularly accessed radio for information. And that doesn't mean they were using other sources. Radio in many parts of rural Africa is the only way to get information. So that was very low, even for rural Africa. After that launch, regular usage jumped just in a few months to 60%, and almost all of that was because people were listening to this one radio station. 84% of the people that we interviewed after the launch said they trusted this station completely. And you may say, well, that just indicates this is a trusting society, but we asked them all these other sources, and the most trusted other media source was the UN Radio Gira, which only 21% said they trusted completely. The least trusted outlet was the Russian supported radio station there, Radio Lengo Sengo, which is not widely listened to amongst the population. But we also saw significant increases in people's perceptions that misinformation can be harmful, significant increases in people's perceptions that they could use media to identify what was true and what wasn't, and significant increases in people saying that I will check the veracity of things before I just go and share it on WhatsApp. So that was some real quantitative evidence. But I'm also I like the qualitative anecdote that I'm going to give you more even than the quantitative evidence. I spent some time at this radio station's headquarters in Bangui, which is in this kind of compound, walled compound, and there's a guardhouse there. And you go in the guardhouse, and there was a stack of passports, maybe about 12 of them, and a stack of national ID cards, about this, quite a few of them. And somebody who was guiding me around said, you know what this is? It's when people lose their ID cards or their passports anywhere in the city, and other people find them, they will bring them to the radio station and leave them here because they trust the radio station. And the people who have lost their ID, their identification, will go to the radio station as kind of lost and found and say, well, maybe somebody turned it in here. They don't go to the mayor's office. They don't go to the police. I can't think of a media organization where it's an important center for the community. And it's because it's been working in the community for 25 years through good times and mostly bad times, and they have this real grassroots connection to the population. How do you build that trust? That's what we're looking to kind of study in more in depth, but it can be done.
The secret is returning people's ID cards, clearly. Michael, I want to talk to you a little bit about, one of the countries that's so involved in disinformation is Russia. I've been to Gagauzia. I've interviewed people during the war where immediately they started talking to me in Gagauzia about the Ukrainian Nazis and tried to set me straight because clearly I didn't follow it. Do you find, as you've looked over the last several years and all of the efforts that Russia has made in the Russian-speaking world, do you see countries or entities being able to combat this effectively in any way?
You know, I was thinking about it this morning when during another panel on civic movements. And when we're talking about various countries here, different countries here, and I was thinking, okay, I was thinking to myself, why didn't work in Georgia? Why didn't really work in Azerbaijan? But why was Ukraine successful? Why there was some success in Armenia? And there are a number of other countries that were, and then I was thinking maybe it's the leader, and then they had a leader of the protest, but not really. Russia had a leader, Navalny, of the Russia protest didn't really work. So basically what I'm seeing right now through our work in quite a few of those countries, and we did have offices we still have offices in Ukraine, we had offices in Moldova, in Tbilisi, in Georgia, and other places, I would say that it's not really about countries, it's more about generational divide these days. Is that the younger generation in those countries, it's easier for us to work with those younger folks. And we actually learned it a long time ago in Ukraine, back in 2014, when actually the war has started. We call the 2022 war as the full-fledged invasion. But in 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, there were quite a few people who we worked with in the eastern part of Ukraine, and they didn't want to participate in our trainings. They were like, okay, you know what, it's the American organization, you're Americans, you will inoculate us with, you know, American values, but we're more Russians than Ukrainians and whatnot. And then slowly but surely, at that point, there was a major divide between older people and younger people. But slowly but surely in Ukraine, it has changed as well, where both older and younger people were more susceptible to participating in our trainings. But once they actually do, once they actually learn how they're being manipulated, they really change. One of the biggest changes, and we conducted this study on one of our programs, actually happened in Jordan. So we worked with a number of universities in Jordan, but we also organized trainings for young women in Jordan. And after our trainings, we asked them to do some testing on how successfully they can recognize disinformation and propaganda. 93% of people who went through our trainings, and some of them have no education whatsoever, they actually were very successful at taking those tests. So to answer your question, I would say, first and foremost, I would recommend us focusing on younger people globally. And then once younger people are engaged in those, they can actually bring their mothers, fathers, babushkas, grandfathers, and grandmothers to those trainings. And this is how you can grow it into communities. Very last thing I wanted to mention, actually, to answer the question about the most successful information media literacy trainings, it's not only about content, it's about how you deliver it. I would say the most effective thing that we ever did as IREX was the first months of the war in 2022 in Ukraine. And we had quite a few programs in Ukraine starting from late 90s. We actually put together a phone-sized little cheat sheet on how to recognize disinformation propaganda and send it out to millions of phone numbers in Ukraine through our partners. Our partners told us that when they were walking down the metro in Kiev, this is where people were hiding during the first days of the war because Russia was bombarding Kiev, they still do that, that there were quite a few people on the escalators, and they could see that they were reading the advice on how to recognize disinformation propaganda. So it's younger people, and it's also delivery methods in addition to the content.
Thank you. Last question to James, and then we're going to have just time for a few quick questions from the floor. James, you were saying that fact-checking is not effective. What have you found in your studies and research that is effective?
I didn't say that it's not effective. I actually did say that it is effective. Okay. And what I said is that it's not used for what so many people think that it should be used for, because I think fact-checking is one of the best ways that journalists actually write, because the kind of how we structure our stories, that we put in a lot of primary evidence. We come to people in academia, we speak to them, we use the material that they produce in our stories, and we use a structure that any reader, if they read what we publish, they can actually arrive to the solutions by not even coming back to us. So I believe that fact-checking is effective, but we still also need to find other approaches, other stuff that we can actually work with, because disinformation and misinformation, as I say, it's a new genre of journalism. This is something literally new. I know that fake news has been there like forever, but it started when social media companies started, a lot of information started coming to people through social media companies. So this is a new field, and this is a new problem, because I've been here, we are discussing democracy, but I think you will all agree with me that the term disinformation, misinformation appears in this conference more than democracy. And that means that this is a big problem that we have. But people are really fighting fact-checking, the thing that so many people have been trying to use to try and inform people, because our work doesn't just involve making people, maybe we are not supposed to, as fact checkers, we are not supposed to tell people to go to vote. That's not our work. Our work is to clean digital spaces, to make them healthy for people who consume information. And that's what we basically do.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions.
Thank you. Thanks. Adam Fivenson with the Center for Security, Innovation, and New Technology at American University, recently separated from the National Endowment for Democracy, where I was working on disinformation as an issue. So, in the moment we're in, given where things are here in DC, we have $250 million from the USAID DRG Center that's no longer going to civil society and media around the globe. You have a large amount of funding, anywhere from about 35 to about 60 million from the Global Engagement Center that's no longer going to this work, especially through grant programs and civil society. You've got money from the NED that's probably anywhere from about 10 to 30 million that very likely will not be going into this sector as well over the next few years. So I'm just wondering, from the panel, your thoughts on where this sector goes over the next few years. There's obviously still money in Europe, although less. A lot of that money is shifting towards security issues. So just wondering how you're thinking about this. Where do we go? How do we adjust? How do we adapt? Do we need to reevaluate our models and our approaches and how we do this work going forward? Or are there elements of what we are doing and have been doing that we should continue to do? How do we look ahead from the moment? So thank you.
Is there anyone who'd like to take that? Big question.
I can start. As a member of the organization which lost a lot of its funding recently because of the terminations of USAID grants and cooperative agreements, I can say that, the situation, it's very early for us to answer this question. We can't really answer it right now. There's no silver bullet. We can just say, let's go to Ford Foundation and they will cover all of the things that were lost. Although many people, I'm sure, were thinking about it as well. I would say that at this point, we just really need to try to continue supporting our beneficiaries in any way we can through existing funding, which is very scarce. But I am, and we had this conversation over lunch yesterday here, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think everything will be back to normal at some point. Don't ask me to define the at some point. It may be 4 years, 8 years, or 20. But I'm pretty sure that the foreign aid and foreign assistance will be back in the United States. It may take a very long time, though.
In the middle, please.
Thank you. It's interesting in a thing about global democracy and executive power. We didn't hear much about executive power. So could you talk a little bit about what does it mean now that we have the dynamics where some of the most important alternative media platforms, social media platforms that a decade or two ago provided space for alternative media on which many of the donor-supported media that Adam kind of alluded to, depended, are now fused with the state, right? Now we have Twitter, which is essentially an extension of the executive branch, and we have the kowtowing of the broligarchy to the increasingly authoritarian executive of the United States, which is in line with many of the other authoritarians, including, your former one in Brazil, et cetera. So this dynamic in some ways is not new because there has always been a lot of executive power in closed societies over the media. But for the past 20 years, we kind of had these alternative sources, which it seems to me are increasingly not alternative. So could you talk a little bit about that dynamic and what that means for disinformation and just more broadly, the viability of fact-based journalism, fact-checking, et cetera?
Jeff, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I've thought about this a lot as a citizen as well, because frankly, some of it terrifies me. And it kind of, I was thinking about with regards to the previous question before, I don't think this is a panacea, but these things tend to move in cycles. Maybe that's overly optimistic, where people do become skeptical of whatever the big entity is, right? And I do think, now I would like to see more empirical evidence in support of this, but I do think there's some reason to be hopeful of like really locally based community media, especially in developing countries. As the media become closer to local populations, it's easier to build trust with those populations. It's easier to be seen as relevant to those local populations and their needs. You often don't need as much money to fund those organizations. There are some community radio stations in parts of rural Africa that only operate for a couple hours a day because that's all they can afford. But they are important sources of information for the community. They're places where the community can gather. And they're important counterpoints to sort of the big media operations. What those organizations can't do, though, is they can't hold national governments accountable all that well because they can't do big, expensive kind of investigative journalism. So they're not a panacea, and they're not going to individually be competitors to the kinds of big corporatized media that you're clearly talking about as well. But we need to sort of diversify that ecosystem, I think, more.
All the media that the global democracy world supported were not just rural stations.
No.
So many of these media were built on Facebook, use Twitter, depend on Instagram. So all of those media now are essentially using state-controlled or state-affiliated media.
Yeah.
Nara, do you have something like that?
You're completely right, like.
Sure.
So a related vein, hi, Cecilia Lehrer from Open Society Foundations and New York University. So a lot of the interventions you've been speaking about are sort of on the end user side. I'm wondering if you have thoughts more on the supply side. The broligarchy we're seeing now, of course, them putting pressure on the Trump administration to put pressure on the EU about undoing privacy regulations that were supposed to be the first step about protecting people's vulnerability to these kinds of algorithms. So thoughts on that and what I think like a multinational advocacy coalition will inevitably have to appear.
We certainly hope so. Yeah. The time, when quite often when we talk about disinformation and propaganda, we say the time to act is right now, because we're losing time. There are so many younger people who are growing up in this right now in this world that is infested with disinformation and propaganda, and there's not much to be done right now. So in the United States, I would argue that the most important thing that we can do right now is integrate information media literacy courses into curriculum of middle schools all across the country. This will not have any effect, any immediate effect, but 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 20 years from now, that would be something that the future generations of Americans will thank us for. But I agree, we would probably need to right now to work together to build coalitions and bring in various different players to this right now.
Well, thank you very much. We have a hard stop. We've gone over a little bit, and we have a speech coming from A.G. Sulzberger from the New York Times at 5 o'clock. So just a round of applause for our panelists, and see you back at 5.